The crack of a gunshot split the silence of the dusty main street of Promise Creek. But it wasn't outlaw trouble this time, just Barton Xavier announcing his return to town after 3 months on a cattle drive. It was 1876, and Promise Creek, Wyoming territory, was still raw around the edges, a place where men were made or broken by the harsh realities of frontier life. The townspeople barely glanced up from their business as Barton rode down the street, his weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. At 32, he'd earned the respect of the townsfolk through honest work and a steady hand. The cattle drive had been successful, bringing much-needed money to the struggling town, but Barton's mind wasn't on business as he guided his horse toward the modest homestead at the edge of town. His thoughts were on his boys Thomas, age 7, and little Samuel, just 5, who'd been left in the care of his sister during the drive. Barton had lost their mother, Elizabeth, to fever 2 winters ago, and raising 2 young boys alone on the frontier was proving to be the hardest challenge he'd ever faced. When he reached the small wooden house, his sister Martha rushed out to greet him, relief evident in her tired eyes. "Thank the Lord you're back, Bart," she said, embracing him quickly. "The boys have been difficult." Barton dismounted, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. "Difficult how?" Martha sighed, pushing a strand of graying hair back under her bonnet. "They won't eat. Haven't touched more than a few bites in 3 days. Thomas keeps saying he's waiting for you, and Samuel follows his brother's lead in everything." Concern furrowed Barton's brow as he tied his horse to the hitching post. "Where are they now?" "Inside. I've tried everything, Bart. I truly have." Barton nodded, squeezing his sister's shoulder. "I know you have, Martha. I appreciate all you've done." Inside the modest cabin, Barton found his sons sitting at the rough-hewn table, 2 untouched plates of beans and cornbread before them. Thomas, the spitting image of his father with the same serious eyes, looked up first. "Pa," he shouted, leaping from his chair and flinging himself into Barton's arms. Samuel followed suit, his small body colliding with Barton's legs. Barton knelt down, gathering both boys close, the smell of trail dust and horse still clinging to him. "I heard you boys aren't eating for your Aunt Martha," he said gently but firmly. Thomas looked down, scuffing his boot on the plank floor. "Wasn't hungry. Not hungry for 3 days." Barton raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound right to me." Samuel piped up. "Food tastes wrong when you're not here, Pa." The simple honesty in his youngest son's words struck Barton to the core. Elizabeth's death had left a void that seemed impossible to fill, and now he realized how his absence affected the boys more deeply than he'd understood. "Well, I'm here now," Barton said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "So let's eat." But despite Barton's return, the boys still pushed the food around their plates, taking only the smallest bites when prompted directly. Martha watched with concern from the kitchen area, then quietly slipped out to tend to her own family next door, promising to check in tomorrow. Barton sat at the table, exhaustion from the long drive and worry for his sons weighing heavily on his shoulders. He needed help, that much was clear. The boys needed more than he alone could provide. The next morning, Barton took the boys into town to restock supplies after the long absence. Promise Creek was bustling with activity. New settlers had arrived while he was away, and the general store seemed busier than he remembered. As they approached, Thomas tugged on his father's sleeve. "Pa, who's that lady?" Barton followed his son's gaze to a young woman he'd never seen before, arranging books on a shelf near the front of the store. She had chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, though wayward tendrils escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple blue dress with a white apron, practical but somehow still elegant. "I don't know, son," Barton replied. "Must be new to town." The storekeeper, old Mr. Gunderson, spotted them and called out, "Barton Xavier, heard the drive went well. Good to have you back." The woman turned at the mention of Barton's name, her warm brown eyes meeting his. Something unexpected fluttered in Barton's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since Elizabeth was alive. "Mr. Gunderson." Barton acknowledged with a nod, then guided his sons into the store. "Boys, you can each pick one piece of candy, but that's all." As Thomas and Samuel deliberated seriously over the candy jars, Barton approached the counter. Mr. Gunderson leaned in conspiratorially. "That's Miss Jessamine Pierce," he said, nodding toward the young woman. "Came in on the stagecoach about a month back, schoolteacher from back east. Been helping out here until the schoolhouse is finished." Barton glanced at Miss Pierce again. She seemed to be in her mid-20s with a quiet confidence in the way she moved. "Schoolhouse. Didn't know we were getting one. Town council decided while you were gone. Got enough children now to warrant it. Miss Pierce comes highly recommended from Boston, educated but not uppity about it, if you understand my meaning." Before Barton could respond, Samuel tugged at his pants leg. "Pa, can we get these?" He held up 2 striped candy sticks. "Just one each, remember?" Barton reminded him gently. Samuel's face fell, and he looked so crestfallen that Barton nearly relented. But he believed in keeping his word and teaching his boys to do the same. "Perhaps I could help," came a melodious voice from behind them. Miss Pierce approached with a kind smile. "One candy now, and perhaps the other could be earned through completing a special task later." Samuel's eyes widened with interest. "What kind of task?" Miss Pierce knelt down to his level. "Well, what are you good at, young man? I can count to 20, Samuel declared proudly. "That's impressive," she said seriously. "And if you could show me tomorrow that you can count all the way to 30, would that be worthy of a second candy?" Samuel nodded enthusiastically, and Thomas, not to be outdone, stepped forward. "I can read some words already." "Then perhaps you could read a page from my favorite storybook," Miss Pierce suggested. "I always carry it with me." Barton watched this exchange with interest. Miss Pierce handled his boys naturally, without the condescension adults often showed children. She glanced up, catching his gaze, and straightened. "Forgive me, Mr. Xavier, I shouldn't interfere with your parenting." She extended her hand. "Jessamine Pierce. I've been engaged as the town's new schoolteacher." Barton took her hand briefly, noting the softness that belied the strength in her grip. "No forgiveness needed, Miss Pierce. I appreciate anyone who can get my boys interested in learning." "Speaking of which," Mr. Gunderson interjected, "school's set to start in 2 weeks, Barton. Your boys are just the right age." Barton hadn't considered formal schooling for the boys yet. On the frontier, practical skills often took precedence, but he'd always valued the education he'd received back in Pennsylvania before heading west. "Something to consider," he said non-committally. Miss Pierce smiled. "No pressure, Mr. Xavier. But the schoolhouse is nearly complete, and all children of Promise Creek are welcome." She turned back to the boys. "I'll be there tomorrow afternoon if you'd like to show me your counting and reading skills." After paying for their supplies and the candy, Barton led the boys back toward home. As they walked, Thomas looked up at his father. "Pa, can we really go see Miss Pierce tomorrow?" "We'll see," Barton said, his mind churning with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, education was important. On the other, the cattle ranch demanded constant attention, and he'd just returned from a long absence. That evening, Barton attempted to cook supper, a skill he'd never properly mastered. The beans were undercooked, the cornbread burnt on the bottom. The boys stared at their plates without enthusiasm, pushing the food around but hardly eating a bite. "Boys," Barton said firmly, "you need to eat to grow strong." Thomas sighed dramatically. "Aunt Martha's cooking was better, and yours is." He trailed off, apparently unable to find a polite way to finish. "Terrible," Samuel supplied helpfully. Despite himself, Barton laughed. "Fair enough, but it's what we have tonight." Samuel pushed his plate away. "I'm not hungry." Barton was about to insist when a knock came at the door. Opening it, he was surprised to find Jessamine Pierce standing on his porch, holding a covered basket. "Miss Pierce," she smiled, a touch of shyness in her expression. "Mr. Xavier, I hope I'm not intruding. Mr. Gunderson mentioned you've been away for some time, and I thought, well, my boarding house serves more food than I can eat, and I thought perhaps you might appreciate some home cooking." The aroma wafting from the basket made Barton's stomach growl audibly. Behind him, he heard small footsteps as the boys approached curiously. "That's very kind, Miss Pierce. Would you care to join us?" The invitation surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I wouldn't want to impose, please," came Samuel's small voice. "Pa's cooking is terrible." Jessamine laughed, a bright, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the very air in the cabin. "Well, with such an earnest invitation, how could I refuse?" She entered the cabin, looking around with interest but without judgment at the somewhat Spartan accommodations. The boys hovered nearby as she unpacked the basket, revealing a still warm chicken pie, fresh bread, and apple preserves. "My landlady, Mrs. Hollister, enjoys cooking for an army even though it's just the two of us. She'll be pleased to know her food found appreciative recipients." As Barton set the table with their best admittedly mismatched plates and utensils, he observed how Jessamine naturally engaged with the boys, asking them questions and listening to their answers with genuine interest. When they finally sat down to eat, Thomas and Samuel dug into the chicken pie with enthusiasm that had been absent at meals for weeks. "This is the best chicken pie ever," Samuel declared, his mouth full. "Samuel, manners," Barton reminded him gently. Jessamine smiled. "It's quite all right." "I take it as a compliment." She turned to Thomas. "And how do you find it?" Thomas, always more reserved than his brother, nodded seriously. "It's very good, madam, thank you. You're both very welcome." Jessamine glanced at Barton. "Mr. Xavier, I understand you've just returned from a cattle drive." The conversation flowed easily as they ate. Barton found himself talking more than he had in months, telling Jessamine about the challenges and rewards of ranching in the Wyoming Territory. In turn, she shared stories of her journey west from Boston and her dreams for the new school. As the meal concluded, the boys began to fidget, their energy returning with their appetites. Barton was about to send them outside to play when Jessamine spoke up. "Would you boys like to hear a story before I go?" Their eyes lit up. "What kind of story?" Thomas asked. "Well, I know many kinds. Would you like to hear about knights and dragons, or perhaps about sailors and sea monsters, or maybe about the stars and how the ancient people saw pictures in them?" "Stars!" Samuel exclaimed, while Thomas simultaneously said, "Sea monsters." Jessamine laughed. "How about a story about sailors who navigated by the stars and encountered sea creatures along their journey?" The boys settled at her feet as she began her tale, weaving an enchanting narrative about brave sailors on a ship called the North Star. Barton watched, mesmerized not by the story itself, but by the animation in Jessamine's face as she told it, and the rapt attention of his sons. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, the cabin felt like a home again, filled with warmth and laughter. The realization both comforted and unsettled him comfort for the present moment of peace. Unease at the thought that this woman, practically a stranger, could so easily bring life back into their home. As twilight deepened outside the windows, Jessamine concluded her story to the disappointed groans of the boys. "Can't you tell another one?" Samuel pleaded. "Perhaps another time," she said, rising to her feet. "It's getting late and I should return to town before dark." "I'll escort you," Barton offered immediately, concerned about her walking back alone. "Oh, that's not necessary, I insist," he said firmly. "These parts aren't always safe after dark." He turned to the boys. "Thomas, you're in charge while I'm gone. Get your brother ready for bed, and I'll be back to tuck you both in." Thomas straightened, proud of the responsibility. "Yes, Pa." Barton saddled his horse and helped Jessamine mount behind him. The feel of her arms tentatively circling his waist stirred feelings he'd long thought dormant. The short ride to town passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the rhythmic clip of hooves and the evening calls of nightbirds. At the boarding house, Barton helped her down, their hands lingering together perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Pierce. And for the story. It's been a long time since I've seen the boys so animated." She smiled up at him, her face half illuminated by the lantern hanging beside the boarding house door. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Xavier. Your sons are wonderful boys." "Would you," he began, then hesitated. "That is, perhaps you might join us for supper again sometime. The boys would enjoy another story." "Just the boys?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. Barton felt a warmth creep up his neck. "I enjoyed your company as well, Miss Pierce. Jessamine, please." "Jessamine," he repeated, liking the way her name felt. "And I'm Barton." "Barton," she nodded. "I would be delighted to join you all again, perhaps this Sunday after church." "We'll look forward to it," he said, tipping his hat before mounting his horse again. As he rode back to his homestead, Barton found himself smiling, truly smiling for the first time in years. The prospect of Sunday suddenly seemed very bright indeed. Over the next few weeks, Jessamine became a regular visitor to the Xavier homestead. The boys blossomed under her attention, especially during story time. She had a gift for spinning tales that captured their imagination while subtly teaching them about history, science, and moral values. One evening in late September, as autumn painted the surrounding landscape in golds and reds, Barton found himself alone with Jessamine on the porch. The boys had finally fallen asleep after 3 stories, and much pleading for just one more. "You have a magic touch with them," Barton said, offering her a cup of coffee. The night air was crisp, hinting at the winter to come. "They make it easy," she replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "They're bright, curious boys." "They weren't eating before you came along," Barton admitted, settling into the chair beside her. "Martha tried everything, I tried everything, nothing worked." Jessamine was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. "Sometimes children express their feelings through what they can control. They couldn't control your absence or," she hesitated, "or their mother's passing, but they could control whether they ate." Barton nodded slowly. "You're probably right, they've been different since you started coming around, happier." "Children need stories," Jessamine said softly. "Stories help them make sense of the world, face their fears from a safe distance." "And what about adults?" Barton asked, turning to face her in the dim light. "Do we need stories too?" She met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps we need them most of all. We just call them by different names: hope, faith, dreams." The school year officially began, and both Thomas and Samuel attended eagerly. Barton found himself lingering when he dropped them off, finding excuses to speak with Miss Pierce, as the children called her at school. The distinction amused him. Jessamine in the classroom, Miss Pierce on the homestead. The first snowfall came early that year, blanketing Promise Creek in white before Thanksgiving. The schoolhouse, heated by a pot-bellied stove, became a warm haven during the day, but the Xavier homestead felt the bite of winter keenly. One particularly cold evening, Barton struggled to keep the fire high enough to warm the drafty cabin. The boys huddled under quilts, waiting for their weekly visit from Jessamine. When a knock finally came, Barton opened the door to find her standing in swirling snow, her cloak dusted white. "You shouldn't have come in this weather," he said, ushering her inside, "and disappoint the boys." "Never," she replied, stomping snow from her boots. Besides, Mrs. Hollister's cousin arrived with her 4 children, and the boarding house is bursting at the seams. I welcomed the escape. The boys emerged from their quilt cocoon, faces brightening at the sight of Jessamine. "Did you bring a new story?" Samuel asked eagerly. "Better," she said, reaching into her basket. "I brought a book of stories so your father can read to you even when I'm not here." Thomas's face fell slightly. "But you tell them best." Jessamine ruffled his hair affectionately. "That's because I've had practice. Your father will improve with practice too." Barton raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure if I should feel complimented or insulted." She laughed, removing her cloak and hanging it by the fire to dry. "Neither. It's simply a fact that storytelling, like any skill, improves with practice." That night, after stories and a simple supper, the snow continued to fall heavily. Peering out the window, Barton shook his head. "You can't go back to town tonight, it's too dangerous." Jessamine looked concerned. "I don't want to impose, it's not an imposition. The boys can sleep together and you can take Thomas's bed, I'll bunk down by the fire." She hesitated, but the howling wind made the decision for her. "Thank you, that's very kind." Later, with the boys asleep, and the cabin quiet save for the crackling fire, Barton and Jessamine sat together in comfortable silence. She was mending one of Thomas's shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight, while he whittled a small wooden horse for Samuel's upcoming birthday. "May I ask you something personal?" Jessamine said suddenly, setting down her sewing. Barton looked up curious. "Of course. The boys never speak of their mother. Is that, by your instruction?" The question caught him off guard, but he answered honestly. "No. I've always encouraged them to remember her, but Thomas was only 5 when she passed and Samuel barely 3. Their memories fade a little more each year." He set down his carving knife. "Elizabeth would hate that. She loved those boys fiercely." Jessamine nodded. "Tell me about her." "If you don't mind." For a moment, Barton thought he might mind talking about Elizabeth had been painful for so long, but to his surprise, the words came easily. "She was stubborn as a mule and twice as clever," he began, a smile forming at the memories. "Followed me out here from Pennsylvania against her parents' wishes. Said if I was fool enough to seek my fortune in the wilderness, someone with sense needed to come along." Jessamine laughed softly. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Barton agreed. "Worked alongside me building this place, never complained even when times were hard. Had a gift for growing things. That garden out back was her pride. Nothing's really thrived there since. Perhaps in the spring the boys could help restart it," Jessamine suggested gently. As a way to connect with her memory, Barton looked at her with newfound appreciation. "That's a fine idea." The conversation flowed easily after that, moving from memories to hopes for the future. Barton spoke of his dreams for the ranch, expanding it so the boys would have a proper inheritance. Jessamine shared her vision for the school, her desire to bring education to children who might otherwise go without. "Why Promise Creek?" Barton asked eventually. "A Boston-educated lady like yourself could have taught in any number of more civilized places." Jessamine was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "My father was a professor at Harvard. He believed education was a sacred calling, but he also believed it should be available to all, not just the privileged. He died last year, and I found myself questioning my purpose. Teaching wealthy children in Boston seemed insufficient somehow. So you came west," she nodded. "Against the very vocal objections of my mother and sisters. They thought I was throwing my life away." A smile played at her lips. "Perhaps I am by their standards. But I've never felt more fulfilled than I do teaching in that one-room schoolhouse." "The town is lucky to have you," Barton said softly. "The boys are lucky. I'm lucky." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a possibility. But neither acted on it, the moment suspended in the warmth of the fire-lit cabin while winter raged outside. Spring arrived late but gloriously in 1877. The land around Promise Creek erupted in wildflowers, and the Xavier homestead saw significant improvements. Barton, with help from neighbors, added a proper bedroom to the cabin, giving the boys more space. The garden, as Jessamine had suggested, was replanted with the boys' enthusiastic if sometimes clumsy assistance. Jessamine was now such a regular presence that townsfolk had begun to speculate about her relationship with the widowed rancher. Some approved, noting the positive change in both Barton and his sons. Others, particularly mothers with unmarried daughters, thought the schoolteacher was overstepping her bounds. One Sunday after church, Barton overheard Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife, speaking to Jessamine. "It's very charitable of you to take such an interest in the Xavier boys, Miss Pierce," she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but charitable. Though some might wonder at the propriety of a young, unmarried woman spending so much time at a widower's home. Before Jessamine could respond, Barton stepped forward. "Miss Pierce has been a godsend to my family, Mrs. Whitmore. I'd thank you not to imply otherwise." Mrs. Whitmore flushed. "I meant no offense, Mr. Xavier. I simply worry about Miss Pierce's reputation." My reputation is my concern, Jessamine said firmly. And I assure you, Mrs. Whitmore, it remains intact. Now if you'll excuse us, the boys are waiting. As they walked away, Barton felt a surge of admiration for Jessamine's composure. I apologize for that, he said when they were out of earshot. It's not the first time, she admitted. Mrs. Hollister has hinted at similar concerns. Barton stopped walking, turning to face her. Does it bother you, what people say? Jessamine considered the question seriously. Not for myself. But I wouldn't want it to affect my position at the school or the boys standing in town. The implication was clear: their unconventional arrangement, innocent as it was, could have consequences. Barton had been grappling with his growing feelings for Jessamine for months, unsure if he was ready to love again, uncertain if she could reciprocate given their different backgrounds. But standing there in the spring sunlight, watching her interact so naturally with his sons as they ran ahead to the waiting wagon, the decision suddenly seemed simple. "Marry me," he said abruptly. Jessamine's eyes widened. "What? Marry me?" he repeated, more gently this time. "Not because of town gossip, but because I love you, because my boys love you, because we're happier when you're with us than when you're not. Barton, I know it's sudden," he continued, "and I know I'm just a rancher without much education or refinement. But I promise to work hard every day to make you happy, to give you a good life here." Jessamine's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Barton, do you truly not know how I feel about you, about your boys?" Hope flared in his chest. "Tell me, I love you," she said simply. "All three of you. These past months have given me more joy than I ever expected to find in Promise Creek or anywhere else for that matter." "Is that a yes?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. "It's a yes," she confirmed with a radiant smile, "but on one condition." "Name it, that we tell the boys together." "Their approval matters to me," Barton laughed, relief and joy making him lightheaded. "I think we can count on their enthusiastic support, but yes, we'll tell them together." That evening, after a celebratory supper at the town's small restaurant, they sat Thomas and Samuel down in the parlor of the boarding house, where Mrs. Hollister had tactfully made herself scarce. "Boys," Barton began, "Miss Pierce and I have something important to tell you." Thomas, now 8 and increasingly perceptive, looked between them expectantly. "Are you getting married?" he asked directly. Barton blinked in surprise. "Yes, actually. How did you know?" Thomas shrugged. "Billy Thornton's pa married his teacher last year. He said first they had lots of suppers together, then they got married." Samuel, not to be outdone, piped up. "Does this mean Miss Pierce will live with us and tell us stories every night?" Jessamine laughed. "It does indeed, Samuel. If that's all right with you both, will you be our new ma?" Thomas asked, more seriously. Jessamine knelt down to his level, taking both boys' hands in hers. "I could never replace your mother, Thomas. She'll always be your ma. But I would be honored to be a mother to you both, to love you and care for you if you'll have me." Thomas considered this solemnly, then nodded. "I think that would be good." Samuel, less constrained by contemplation, threw his arms around Jessamine's neck. "Does this mean I can have 2 candies sometimes?" The adults laughed, the tension of the moment broken. "We'll see," Barton said, his heart fuller than he could ever remember it being. "We'll see." The wedding took place in June, a simple ceremony in the church with most of the town in attendance. Mrs. Whitmore, surprisingly, had become one of the match's strongest supporters once it was properly announced, even offering her garden for the reception. Barton stood at the altar, Thomas and Samuel beside him in new suits, waiting for his bride. When Jessamine appeared in the doorway, wearing a modest white dress with wildflowers in her hair, he felt a momentary pang, not of regret or betrayal to Elizabeth's memory, but of gratitude for the second chance at happiness he'd never expected to find. As Jessamine walked toward him, he reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought them together. A cattle drive, 2 stubborn boys who refused to eat, and stories told by lamplight had somehow led to this moment of new beginnings. "Are you ready?" the minister asked as Jessamine took her place beside Barton. "More than ready," Barton replied, taking her hand in his. And with his sons standing proudly beside them, he knew it was the absolute truth. 2 years later, the Xavier homestead had transformed. The cabin was now a proper house with a dedicated schoolroom where Jessamine taught the boys and several neighboring children during the winter months when travel to town was difficult. The garden flourished under her care, and a new orchard of young apple trees promised future harvests. On a warm September evening, Barton sat on the expanded porch, watching Thomas and Samuel play with their 1-year-old sister, Elizabeth Josephine Xavier, named for both the mother they'd lost and the one who'd found them. Jessamine joined him, settling into the rocking chair beside his, their hands automatically finding each other. "Happy?" he asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Completely," she replied, smiling as Samuel dramatically fell to the ground, pretending to be vanquished by his sister's fierce crawling attack. "You, more than I deserve," he said honestly. "Exactly what you deserve," she corrected him, squeezing his hand. "Exactly what we all deserve." As twilight deepened into dusk, Jessamine called the children in for supper. Unlike those difficult days when Barton had first returned from the cattle drive, there was no coaxing required. The children came willingly, hungry not just for food but for the inevitable stories that would follow, stories of brave cowboys and clever schoolteachers, of journeys and homecomings, of families made both by blood and by choice. Later, with the children finally asleep, Barton and Jessamine stood together at the window, looking out at the star-filled Wyoming sky. "Tell me a story," he whispered against her hair. Jessamine turned in his arms, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Once there was a brave, lonely cowboy whose boys refused to eat." Barton smiled, knowing exactly how this particular story ended, not with happily ever after, which suggested an ending, but with happiness continuing to unfold, day by day, story by story, in the home and family they had built together.